I was recently looking at pictures of cancerous tumors, that is to say I was browsing Facebook, and I happened across this image, which says, "No, people aren't more sensitive now, people aren't too politically correct now, nor are people just looking for a reason to be offended now. We, as a people, know better now. Therefore we, as a people, are trying to do better now." When I first read this, I knew there was something wrong with it, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I was about to move on when I realized that actually I'd encountered a very similar argument years ago. The argument that it reminded me of was presuppositional apologetics, in the sense that in both cases the person making the argument can't actually explain their own standard, except by appealing to their conclusion in a circular way. This creates statements like, "I just know," in both cases. In presuppositional apologetics, the argument is that the Christian knows with absolute certainty that God exists and that the laws of logic are true because, well, God told him so, in such a way that he could be absolutely certain, because God can do stuff like that. A good counter-argument to this claim comes in the form of a rhetorical challenge. Make a list of 5 things that you know with absolute certainty, then make another list of 5 other things you know but not with absolute certainty, and then tell me how you distinguish between those 2 categories in your mind. The answer, of course, is that you can't. You can only distinguish between the ones that are convenient for your argument and the ones that are not. I think this same kind of question can be directed toward oversensitive people who are claiming to just know better. Make a list of 5 things that are legitimate grievances to have, then make another list of 5 things that are simply the result of people being oversensitive, and then tell me how you distinguish between those things in your mind. Now at this point, the analogy with presuppositional apologetics does break down a bit. In presuppositional apologetics, there is no answer, and that's what this question is designed to expose. In the case of social outrage, however, I think that there are legitimate outrages to be had, so of course I must believe that it is possible to distinguish between legitimate complaints and contrived ones. The reason I would still ask this question is because it seems that most social justice people have never actually sat down and thought about how far is too far. They'll just keep going at it as long as it's even vaguely plausible, and of course, almost anything can be made to sound vaguely plausible. That was the point of my video, Sexist Guessing Game. To a third-party observer, it's impossible to tell sincere grievances from satirical ones because there's nowhere these people won't go. How do you know you're not being oversensitive? What are your criteria besides your own self-serving self-diagnosis? And this really highlights the self-defeating nature of the argument presented by this image, because even the most oversensitive, hyper-offended oppression Olympian could use this defense, and would use this defense, claiming that they just know better now and are trying to do better now. No matter how outlandish and petty their claims were, they could still defend themselves with this argument. So of course we now get to the real question, which is, okay Venaloid, if you're gonna shit on other people's standards, what are yours? Where do you draw the line between legitimate and spurious cries of injustice? At what point do you think it's okay to have a top-down solution, rather than to simply deal with things on a case-by-case basis? Of course, no answer I give will cover all possible situations, but my criteria would be something along these lines. In the case of predicted suffering, there should be some evidence of causality. There is no reason to believe that a painting of a gorilla would cause anyone to suffer, or that video games will make people sexist, to name a couple examples. Number 2, the suffering, predicted or current, should be high enough and widespread enough that a person cannot be reasonably expected to deal with it as a personal issue if it affects them. It's a lot like the difference between foods that some people are allergic to versus foods that are poisonous to all humans. It can be reasonably expected that people with peanut allergies can deal with it themselves, but I don't think it can be reasonably expected that everyone knows every possible poison they might be served unless they specifically ask the waiter about each one. A side note on trigger warnings: the reason I support content warnings for images of gore and mutilation, but not for things like verbal references to rape, is because most people are born with a powerful disgust for these types of visual inputs, much like the powerful and universal human aversion to feces. Things like the word master or the study of rape laws, however, are not even close to universally horrifying in this same way. Number 3, unequal treatment under the law or other governing rules. Hopefully this is a pretty understandable, if not just obvious, position to take. Number 4 is a bit of a gray area, but I'd still like to include it, which is Situations where personal prejudices are given real power either through business or through law. One of the best examples of such a top-down solution that I agree with on this front would be the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Sure, those same problems probably would have gone away a lot slower and much less completely under just the free market kind of system, but I really do think that the Civil Rights Act and laws like it are the better, more effective solutions. And finally, number 5. Now, this doesn't necessarily make a complaint legitimate, but I think it does correlate with legitimate complaints based on the previous criteria, which is the grassroots nature, or not, of the complaint. The people who complain about trigger warnings and microaggressions are not everyday people off the street who are all noticing these same problems organically. As far as I can tell, these ideas arise from a specific political group whose members all talk to each other, passing around their overgrown analyses like some kind of verbal hookah, and eventually, everyone in the Intersectional Oppression Club is seeing the Virgin Mary in every piece of toast they come across. Meanwhile, people who aren't members of this group just see a piece of toast. If the Virgin Mary really did appear on every piece of toast, surely strangers would notice it too, or at least other people who share those oppressed characteristics, but by and large, they don't. Most black people don't associate the phrase master's degree with slavery. Most people with mental disabilities don't associate the phrase mad scientist with themselves, and most women would not feel excluded by the image of a male gorilla. The YouTuber Blair White recently made a similar observation about gender non-conforming people, as opposed to transgender people. You can find transgender people from all walks of life, conservative, liberal, religious, atheist, etc., but pretty much every non-binary, omnigendered, quadrisexual person is part of the feminist gender circle jerk, which makes their claims a lot more suspect. There are infinitely many details of our lives which, if you overanalyze them enough, could be construed as potentially oppressive or offensive. This is why it's important to have some way of distinguishing legitimate grievances from superfluous ones. A lot of people, however, don't seem to have a standard and don't seem to want one. They seem to prefer to humble brag about their contrived suffering and subsequent heroism at the drop of a hat. A hat, incidentally, whose Made in Taiwan sticker triggers vicarious flashbacks of post-colonial intersections of ableist heteropatriarchies.